Hello and welcome to a Taylor's Tales podcast. This is Chris's Corner. I'm your host, Chris Taylor, and welcome back to a new episode. This week we have a brand new guest. I am absolutely, astounded to have someone out of the blue, out of the life. I jumped into his life and sort of picked him out of nowhere and surprised him. Welcome, Dan Clifton. How you doing, Dan?
Hello, not too bad, thanks. Yourself?
I'm doing great, man. I'm great. Glad that you're here, and glad we can talk a little bit of history.
Yeah, glad to be here, man. Thanks for inviting me.
That's all right, mate. I think and shout out to Johnny Edwards, who's linked us together a little bit. Who's stated your knowledge, your interest. I think that's the main thing. We're going to try and learn something together today, and we're going to be covering the beginnings of Roman history. Dan, what really got you into history in this area?
History as a whole is just an awesome subject, I think. I never studied it in school at A-levels, which I really regret, and I haven't gone to university to study it either, which I also really regret. But did it at GCSEs, and some of the subjects are, they're okay, but ancient history, like classical history, antiquity, it's just really interesting and in-depth. A lot of it is like stories. The closest thing you can get to a fantasy novel,
yes,
comes from old classic folk tales and stories from then.
Oh, I love that, man. I really do, because I get I've spoken about this many a times on the podcast about talking about Jordan Peterson and the ability to be able to find real life and adapt it from tales. Like I use the book The Warrior King, the Lover and the Magician as a good reference, in the sense that we all have these archetypes that are in the hero story. And so history is just that ability to look back in time and be able to understand, what these archetypes are. Sorry, I might be talking about subjects that are a little bit out there. Have you heard of these sort of like concepts before, the archetypes?
In terms of how like a story is made, you have your protagonist and antagonist, and you got the horrible evil stepmother. Yeah, like even when you look into Roman history and stuff, that's all in there as well.
Mate, you're picking at the heartstrings right now. It really is.
Honestly, history is awesome, and any subject you can get into history, you get into the nitty gritty details of it, like the culture, the religion, theocracy, the political intrigue to it. Game of Thrones could basically be history if it chose to be.
So true, man. You take mythology, you take a good story, you can basically make it become our past in its sense. So totally agree. I was going to ask, I have skipped ahead a little bit already, and I get ahead of myself from time to time. Dan, welcome to the podcast. And first off, I'd just like to say, I always like to start the podcast off with a new guest by asking, how would you describe yourself to some brand new people?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Let's see. Do the introduction speech. Hi, I'm Daniel Clifton. I am the lamest guy you could possibly meet because I'm the nerdiest man in the world. Yeah, that probably sums it up pretty well, actually.
Dan,
I'm pretty nerdy, pretty lame.
That's so good, but you know what? That would get so many. I think you'd immediately make people laugh, and therefore you've already got people on your side immediately, straight off the bat, man. That's brilliant.
It's the truth.
It's the
right above the webcam, I've got the D&D screen above.
Oh, wow, really? Oh, man.
Yeah.
It's the one thing that I couldn't get into. I think it was ruined for me by other people. Like D&D is definitely a player game where it's only as good as the people you're with. Am I right in saying that, or am I?
Yeah, it's true. I think the same with any kind of tabletop game. You need to play with some good friends, I think.
Yeah. And do you have a good group of mates who play it with you?
Yeah, I've got a couple of good friends who get involved. It's sometimes quite entertaining, pretty funny.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think I've lost count on how many times I've face palmed, but it's pretty good.
That's brilliant, man. I mean, stuff like that. Like you said, if you can get into fantasy, you can get into history, and I think we're diving in today into a little bit of a niche area, but also something that thoroughly interests me. And I'm here to learn from you as much as I imagine we're going to learn together through some of these like pieces of information.
Oh, I fully expect to learn something new today.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. I love that attitude. Jumping in straight away. We've talked about like your love for history. What specifically in the beginnings of Rome, what comes to mind for you when you're thinking of the beginnings of Rome?
I think thinking about Rome, the first thing I think anybody will go to is they think about the empire.
Yeah.
And they think about this huge cultural identity that more or less conquered the entirety of the Mediterranean, and as such existed, and its legacy stands to this day. Things like you mentioned earlier on, we've got the roads that goes around. I think as well, talking about you got the military, like Roman military, things of that kind of ideals and the way it's structured has persisted into modern times as well. Even the way their camps were laid out, you can kind of see that in terms of American street design, how everything's all blocky because the Romans would have their camps very much in an orderly fashion.
That's amazing. I never thought of it that way. That's so true.
You got our wonderful capital city of London. That was basically made from Romans. Like, to think 30-minute train ride away, and I could be going back 2,000 years.
2 hours for me, but like, yeah, from Reading. Just, but that's
very true.
so true, so true. It's sort of like the architecture that we see today is a reflection of the period, like the period of Rome. So the beginnings of Rome, even then, are reflected in today's society. Yeah. What do you think that if you could take like one piece of sort of like Roman architecture or anything, is there any piece that you think of immediately and like that's it, that's what I like, that's exactly what I'd like to see?
I think, man, from being a child and going to places like Rome and Pompeii as a kid, it's always going to be the Colosseum. That's the first thing you see and you go, yeah, that's Rome. Yeah. Or the ruins of the Roman forums as well.
Oh,
yeah. Man, have you been?
I have, yeah.
Oh, it's awesome, isn't it? It's like it's going back in time. You feel like you're Indiana Jones. I'm going to let you
down a little bit, because I didn't like the Colosseum. No, I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine.
But I have expressed this before to people, and it's only because I was expecting the Colosseum to have still the sand ground, like the sand box.
Yeah.
And when I got there and they had like the maze in the middle of it, I was like taken aback a bit. I was like expecting I don't know.
It's a little bit of a letdown when you think how it might have used to look like before.
Yes, yeah, exactly. With the crowds roaring, but I totally agree with you on the forum. It's just man. Yeah. But when did you visit? When were you there?
Jeez, God, I was young, probably. Oh, God, I must have been about 10, 11, so 20, I'm not 30 yet, geez, about 14 odd years ago, maybe.
So that had quite an effect then, I imagine. Like,
yeah, being there and going and seeing it in person definitely leaves an effect, because you hear the stories, and it's only when you see it with your own eyes you're like, oh wow, that's actually real. Yeah. You hear about an amazing creature, you don't believe it exists until you see it. Until you go to a zoo and you're like, elephants are real? What? Like, oh, that's so cool to see it in person. And I would definitely recommend, if you haven't, and any of your listeners as well, if you get the chance to go to Pompeii, go check it out. Pompeii's awesome.
Yeah.
It is just surreal.
Does Pompeii, you know, I always think of the dust, the volcano, the sort of environment of some volcanic ash. Is it just a still place? I imagine it's quite a quiet place. What's it actually like?
When I went there, it was about autumn time, so out of the term time season. So a lot of the kids were at school, and I remember walking around there with my parents, and it was pretty quiet on that day. And, you know, a bit of prophetic fallacy. It was cloudy, pretty miserable looking, kind of grim. And obviously not a lot has survived, but you can see like the main cobblestone streets, some of the buildings they've managed to unearth, a couple of old mosaics, but just being in that presence in a place that had suffered such a catastrophic event is, oh man, it almost sends a shiver down your spine.
Your description, mate, makes me feel like I'm there. I'm feeling like we're already stepping through the streets together right now. Yeah, you're setting a scene, man. That makes me want to go and experience it for myself. So that's cool.
Definitely worth a visit for a day trip. Yeah, and climb up Mount Vesuvius as well, because that's awesome.
That's another thing ticked off the life list. That's a definite life list ticker right there. I'm definitely gonna have to chuck that on there. That's beautiful. So you've been inspired by these experiences. You already have like a keen interest in history, fancy things. When I sort of present you with the ideas of Romulus and Remus, what's the first like bit that you're like, oh, that's the start. That's the start of Rome.
It's that tale in itself. Again, that's one of those fantasy story moments because it's such a myth. Come on, you got two twin boys prophesied to take down a king, so they get ordered to be killed and get thrown into a river, but instead they are saved and suckled on the teat of a wolf, and absolute bollocks. When you think about it, it's like, come on, that is absolute rubbish. But it's what they went with, and I think that's just amazing.
But dude, you've got entire religions that are built off that. So, you know, there is that.
Exactly. But Rome, its founding is it's drowning in those myths.
Yes.
And it almost feels like it's, when you read up about it, that it has been constructed to give later Romans a reason as to why things came about beforehand. So, yeah, Romulus and Remus, the two of them, these twin brothers, quite capable, end up becoming, well, creating their own little city.
Yes.
After killing one of the others.
But, yeah, I think Romulus kills Remus, which is typical sort of, you know, it's even goes into Christendom and the idea of like Cain and Abel. And you know, we kill Abel to be able to, you know, get everlasting life, and you so on and so forth, and you're sort of banished into life from there.
Yeah, so even their mother, a woman called Ray Silvia, was a daughter of one of the old kings beforehand of like a local tribe. Yeah. And that is reflected in Christianity, because you talk about Mary being the Vestal Virgin, Ray Silvia was the Vestal Virgin. Yeah. And the father of Romulus and Remus is meant to be Mars, the god of war. So
I had no idea.
It's interesting how these things relate.
No. I think I'm kind of blown away a little bit, because I didn't know it was Mars who was the typical father. That's such a link between Christ himself and Remus, and Romulus, I should say. It's kind of crazy.
Well, I think it all changes depending on which source you read, because in some depictions it's Mars who's the father, or in some cases it would be Hercules, because in all honesty, Rome and Greek are quite similar. Like you've done your Greek mythology little talks beforehand, so you know the Roman gods are almost a spitting image of the Greek gods, just with slightly different names.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's like, I might be wrong in saying like Jupiter, the great strength, and you've got Zeus, this leader of the Greek gods, and you've got war, and you've got Mars reflecting Aries, and it's just this beautiful sort of such I would say it's a juxtaposition of like the two countries being so similar at the same time. Like they're so different, but they're so similar. And this links really well to what I was going to lead on to, is the idea that Romulus and Remus, there is a source that says that they actually started from the Trojan War.
Yeah.
Did you read about that at all? Did you see?
Yeah, so that's I'm assuming you're talking about Aeneas.
Yes.
And I think who wrote it? It was Livy or Virgil, the Aeneid.
Yeah, they're refugees.
Trojan prince.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Pronunciation's always iffy. But yeah, that story is the fall of Troy and the Trojan prince, who I believe is Aeneas, and his followers end up sailing the Mediterranean for a while. They even go to Carthage, meet up with Queen Dido, and there's a little bit of discussion there where they fall in love, and then he abandons her on the call to duty from the gods, and she doesn't like it, so she curses him, and more or less, it's that fantasy story, this myth thing of that entire story is more or less an excuse and a reason to the later Punic Wars that occurred later on when the Roman Republic became a thing. Yeah.
That's so true as well. The common story of the myth there, where the woman is spited by the male hit protagonist, and then there's like some sort of curse or repercussions because of it, is so common. I love it because it's so funny to be able to dive into that and be like, whoever wrote this, you're not being creative. We've seen this before in many other stories.
I know. Well, for people in our age now, we can look back on that and be like, what a load of trash.
Yes.
But when you went back then with those guys, man, like they were superstitious as hell. Temples everywhere, have to devote, make sacrifices to their gods, devote some money, make sure the temples are maintained. A whole different society, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Am I wrong in saying that they had like different temples for the different gods, and based off the god that you were sacrificing was like a different animal or something along those lines? I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was like Mars had a temple, and then they'd sort of sacrifice a defeated warrior at the head of the sort of like temple area.
Pardon me.
Right? No.
Yeah, so temples, each god will have their own temple. Although I believe some would share, as you got like the Pantheon.
Yes.
I think that still exists, actually. That was one of the places I did not get to visit when I was in Rome.
I've seen the Pantheon. Yeah, it's a beautiful structure.
I've got to go check it out.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, exactly. We're going to do this podcast and you're just going to be wanting to go back to Rome. Ironically, the reason I went to Rome in the first place was, I think we've tied this in. There's a little bit of nerdiness to this, but I was playing Assassin's Creed for a lot at that period of time.
Oh, yes. Brilliant series.
So you
Assassin's
can
Creed
understand
2 and
the
Brotherhood, right?
18-year-old me wanting to go.
Oh, yes.
Oh, dear.
And to see it afterwards and be so, total disappointment.
Oh, don't, mate, don't. It's terrible because you think of all of the... at the same time, I wasn't disappointed because the sort of landscape portrayed in video games is actually so realistic nowadays. When I did go to Rome, I was like, this is crazy accurate.
Yeah.
Some of the places, you're like, wow.
Yeah, completely scary. But yeah, going back to the gods, sacrifices were a common thing for sure. I think in some of the tales, they sacrifice goats and sheep and other sorts of cattle. I wouldn't put them past them to, sacrifice losers in warfare as well. Rome is just so gritty.
Yes. Yeah.
From its very inception, so grim, dark, gritty society of people.
Well, you have the starts of Rome being created by one brother sliding another one down and saying, I'm the leader.
There's another event that happened in that past in Roman history. So when they were finding the settlement, and they had their own little followers, they kind of made a name for themselves, got a little bit of a cult following, if you will. but they needed to attract people to their settlement if they're going to stay there.
Yes, because it was a small village.
Yeah, it was like a little small tribal gathering, and the people who ended up going there were less than reputable people, like thieves, people who were runaway slaves, or those with stupid amounts of debt, and they're looking for a fresh start.
Yeah.
So they all go over there, and just so happens the majority of them are male. So you kind of need, if your settlement's going to flourish, you need to have children.
Yes.
So one of the really gritty things that happened during Romulus's reign, and one of the tales, is what's referred to as the rape of the Sabine women, in which they held a festival and all the local tribes around the neighborhood came along and they stole all their women.
No, I had no idea. That's crazy. And this was, how did they get away with it? That's my first question. That's crazy.
It's madness. There was all a massive war about it that kicked off. There's a couple of art pieces actually which kind of depict the scene.
Oh, wow.
But apparently the women who were kidnapped intervened in some of the conflict and was like, no, we're your daughters and your husbands, and we have your sons and grandsons. If you can't get along, can we please just get along?
Crazy.
Yes.
Madness.
It's very gritty.
Oh my good. Yeah. No wonder. So when you were saying that, these dark beginnings, I had no idea that was so true. I knew that the murder was there. I knew that the sort of village was small and they were sort of acclimatized into the area by bringing more people to it. But I had no idea that, that the large group were male and therefore they brought in slaves, basically, from another tribe.
Yeah, it's scary stuff.
Can you imagine nowadays our generation trying to fight off another tribe?
Geez. Yeah, the chaos, absolute chaos.
So, is this Palatine Hill? I'm right in saying that. Is this the area where sort of like Romulus sets up camp and goes from there?
Yeah, more or less. There was 2 hills, and talking before the conflict with Romulus and Remus, it's in the legend. Romulus is on the Palatine and Remus is on the Aventine, which is just across the way. And they're both, we want to build our settlements here. And there's a bit of discourse between who's going to be the leader of the settlement. Ooh. So they go to these hills and they start with each other. And then there's different accounts because it's all based on myth, really. There's one of them which talks about 6 vultures landing at the feet of Remus. And then when his followers go over and proclaim that to Romulus's followers, 12 vultures arrive at his feet. So one is like, they came to me first. And it was like, but I've got a better number. And so the conflict kicked off that way.
That's so funny. That's like the biggest dick measuring contest.
Exactly. But with birds.
My God. Oh, dear. So, obviously we're playing mythology right now, so I'm not going to try and like pin down the facts too much, but like why do you think like birds came into like this matter? Why eagles? Or like, isn't the eagle like the representation of like the Roman legions?
That's like the old the banners, the old SPQR banners. It would always be the legion, the symbol of the Imperium. But I think back in those days, because at that point it would be known as the Roman Kingdom as opposed to the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. Things just change over time, really. It's still early days in that period, and it's just a myth, an excuse to kind of give an origin story for the Romans, if you will. At least that's my interpretation of it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic interpretation. It's the right way of thinking about it. Is like you're thinking it as if it's mythology, but like little sort of droplets of truth being spread around every now and then. And sort of like how because we know for a fact that how Rome began was in sort of a republic style. There was democratic sort of voting being done to the local councillors or whatever you want to call them, the sort of like figureheads of Rome after Romulus sort of like died. There was that beginning to vote people in. this is a period of time after the battle. So we've got quite a lot of grey area here, what you'd call the nitty gritty or the dark ages of Rome. Is there anything that I'm missing here? Is there anything that you think stands out in your mind, like this is a really key event before the sort of kings and the elected period of the Roman history?
Well, with Romulus, he was essentially the first king of Rome. And the tale goes that there's 7 kings of Rome. Was there actually 7 kings of Rome? Probably not, because each of them has reigned for about 35 years, which, kings don't normally reign that long.
Yeah.
Unless they all start from a relatively younger age. And some of the details about their stories, some of the tales that come involved with that are, again, that kind of nitty-gritties, almost stereotypical type stories. One of them, I forget his name, but it's like the 6th king of Rome. He wasn't really into it that much. He wasn't interested in being a king, whereas his wife really was. And she was like, you better, Lord, authorize your power and, be a good king. And he's like, so what? I don't really care. But his brother really wanted to be king. And his brother's wife didn't really give a crap. So the 2 of them, the ambitious ones, killed their partners and hooked up, and that was the 7th king. So many little gritty stories like that.
Yeah. And in this case, this is the usurper, because he's known as the usurper, isn't he? The 7th king.
Yeah, the Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. Not Superbus.
That's a mouthful as a name. They go with their seriously manly, I am the king of the naming conventions, basically here.
Oh yeah, Scipio Africanus. Oh, there's so many of them. There's just so many names.
I love it. So good, man. So these 7 kings, and again, we're diving into the sort of age, but Romulus reigned from 1753 to around 1715 BC. That's quite a long time, and as you said, the next kings sort of reigned for 35 years. Am I wrong in saying that most kings they murdered each other up to this point and in this period of history? So it's kind of intriguing to see.
Definitely, for sure. I mean, talking about the origin story, Romulus and Remus's grandfather's a gentleman called Numitor, who was exiled from his old people, which is another local tribe in the region, descendants of Aeneas. That whole period in time is just conflict, and Rome is, as a society, built by their military powers. It's might is not right, but for Rome, they were successful and they survived for so long because they were good in the fight. So there was a hell of a lot of fighting.
100%. So if that's the case, why do you think they want their history to be reflected in these 7 kings that have these quite long reigns individually?
I think it's just that, going back to just giving it an excuse to kind of build a foundation as to why that society is the way it is. Like Romulus, who founded the city of Rome? Romulus. Who organized the legions? Well, Romulus. Romulus is the answer to all those questions. Yes. And then some of the later kings will be the answers to so many other questions. Like the second one is the second king's slightly struggling with the name. I think it's Numa, who was more of a theological individual, really into his religion. So he was the one who organized titles like the Pontifex Maximus, which, fun fact, exists still today. It's owned by the Pope.
No way. So hang on, he can sort of go ahead and name people with this title.
Pontifex Maximus is a title given to the senior religious figure in Roman culture.
Wow.
And that has managed to survive right the way through to modern days. In fact, I found this out earlier as well.
Sick title. If you ever want to go anywhere in the world and get screw a knighthood, I want to be known as Pontifex Maximus.
Yeah. It's an amazing title. And I only found this out earlier on, but if you actually checked out the Pope on Twitter, his Twitter tag is Pontifex.
Wow. I don't have Twitter, so I didn't know this. This is crazy.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's a level of ego that he's like, you know what? I'm ready to be known as Pontus for the. That's brilliant. Oh my god.
It just carries on. So many legacies from that period. Like the third king. Any questions about Rome's origins? Well, he would probably be the reason as to why that's the case as well. It's just a convenient answer, really.
Yeah. Well, weren't those four kings the first four kings elected? So technically speaking, the people put forward these stories, these ideas as foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right.
Fascinating idea, because it's almost like, when you think of Rome, I always think of an empire that is sort of determined by like the leader that I always think of like Marcus Aurelius and Caesar and like all of these big characters that represent Rome, and they determine the history. But there is little bits and pieces where you're thinking actually it was a people's republic in the majority of the time. Do you think that the people, even in this period of time of history, the Roman people were quite lucky in the sense that they had this ability, even if there was savagery around it?
I think it's really weird because I'm not massively political. I keep up to date with it, but I'm not super involved because normally that stuff tends to lead to arguments.
100%.
But to think that Rome was the Roman Republic, should I say, was one of the earliest democracies in the world, and democracy in the sense that people voted for a leader, and that leader would 9 out of 10 times do the job they intended to do, and they did a pretty good job of it. Only at later points where you get to the likes of Julius Caesar did it ended up becoming more of a imperium, more of that slightly dictatorship.
Yeah.
And I think being able to look back and compare now, like hindsight's always 20/20.
Yes.
But just seeing it and seeing a resemblance between back then and today's societies, like American Congress, somewhat similar to the Senate.
Yes. Yeah, and we saw the capital get rioted. If we go straight back to Rome, this was a common thing. It happened like 3 times. The Gauls came all the way from Germany to Rome and sacked it within a day. So
I think Rome. Yeah, I think you're right. I think Rome was sacked 3 times.
Yeah. So you think about that, like Rome as an empire, just as big as America. We take that link. It should remind us as a part of history that the Americans, don't be too worried about other nations. Be worried about the people living in your country and elsewhere. They have the power to come forward.
Yeah.
I always love that idea that you've put forward there. But
even the fall of the Roman Empire, basically the entire empire split into 2, West and East, and the West crumbled away, but the East survived and became the Byzantine Empire.
Yes.
And they ended up surviving until like the 1500s, until they fell away.
It was Caesar Augustus, wasn't it? Who was who became Constant, like he was Constance after that, or something along those lines. Right.
Augustus the Great, I believe, and Constantine the Great and Caesar Augustus. Yes.
Thank you. Yes.
It's been a while.
No, dude, 100%. And that's really taken me back, because I know we're skipping all over the place with history, but it's a really important point you've made, is that ending of the empire, like you said, it lasted all the way up till, and I'm pretty sure the Byzantine Empire became the Ottoman Empire after a while.
Yeah.
And so that lasted all the way up until the First World War in 1914.
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, yeah, you're spot on. Rome exists today, but legacies everywhere.
Legacies everywhere. We were talking about this before the podcast started, guys. The ideas of legacy we're going to talk about later, but it is fascinating that Dan's made this point, that we see today these sort of like little influences all over, just from the beginning tales of Rome, just by starting where we have and slowly trailing to this point. Absolutely fascinating. So we've talked a little bit about sort of the mythology, and we've talked about the beginning bit where we physically get actual history, where we're going to get some actual history now. So I'm pretty sure after the seven kings, we had the actual monarchy. Am I right in saying that? Do we have like monarchy afterwards, or did it become a republic after that?
I think after that point it became the Republic. After the Seven Kings, they basically outed out Superbus, or Superbus, however you want to pronounce his name.
Yeah.
And then the Senate and everybody else, the populace, were like, nope, we're not having any more kings. And that would end up staying for the entirety of Rome moving forward. Later on in the history, I think there was an attempt by the exiled king to come back, but they were like, nope.
Oh, really?
And they nipped that in the butt.
Yes. Well, it became a prized possession for the country. It was like, if you had democracy in your nation, it was that same idea of in Greece, where democracy was then fought against with, we all know the story of 300 in the idea of fighting against this huge empire from the east to defend the very democracy that they have. It's just, fascinating. Is there anything from the beginning of the Republic that, what made it so strong at the beginning, and do you know why it lasted for so long?
I think again this is kind of speculative back in that era of time, because like we mentioned earlier on, Rome has been sacked numerous times.
Yes.
And I think the first time it was sacked is roughly about 300 BC, which is mid-Republic. And at that point, a lot of information is lost. So that's probably why some of the origin stories of Rome are as,
sparkly. Let's call it sparkly.
Thank you. That's the word. All dressed up,
All dressed up and ready to go on a night out. I love it.
Yeah, and past that point, it starts to become more accountable, more reputable sources of knowledge. Yes. But those early days of the Republic, again, that almost falls into that somewhat fictional category. And when you look into that, the way it was designed and run, so you have your Senate, you have your 100, 200, 300, however many people it was in the end, depending on whoever's running. They would be your advisors, and they would be like the voice of the people. Or they would have the ultimate power. They would select for new leaders of the country, and those leaders would be known as the consuls. And typically there would be two of them. And during that earlier point as well, those people elected into those positions were really good leaders, and they took upon themselves that role of being a leader of a republic. And when it was their time to stand down, they stood down.
Right.
There's also they made a law about dictatorships. They were one of the first people to institute dictatorships. However, their dictatorships weren't like the dictatorships today, where they were elected and there was a single person who had total authority over everything the country did, or the republic did. However, their term was only 6 months, and after 6 months they had to stand down. And the people who ended up taking up that role, the early ones anyway, did indeed step down. And it's ridiculous to think about that. You're a man who gets given ultimate power.
Yes.
And you give it back?
Yeah. I was just about to say, they say that, the most common saying you hear when it comes to power is power corrupts absolutely. So
yeah.
You're saying after 6 months of getting a nice taster of the sweetest food you've ever had in your life, and you get told, give it back now.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Admittedly, that position was only given during great moments of crisis, like civil wars or external threats. There's a tale about a consul, a dictator called Cincinnatus, who was elected a couple of times, who was involved in these things. He came to quell a rebellion and quell an invasion. And after both times, he ended up going back to his farm and working his plow. Of course, that's all bullshit, because that's just fictional as hell.
So it's brilliant.
He's the ideal image of a Republican citizen.
Right. That makes so much sense. It's like the idea of the communist, the workhorse, the idea of what's actually real and what's not.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. so cool. And
Obviously,
so
every story has a hint of truth in it.
yeah, well, if this isn't real, what is the reality then? What was the reality of this?
Exactly. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody's ever going to know.
Oh, that's so good though. I love it. I love that because we can dive in and basically we could make up as many tales. You know, you could have like as many dictators or as many sort of like peaceful republicans as you wanted.
Yeah.
There's only one that ever comes to mind when it comes down to the one that everyone knows, and that's Caesar. And obviously after Caesar, it was the biggest dictatorship of all time. You know,
Yeah.
after this, even if it is a tale that is laced in mythology, because it, like you say, a lot of this history is like, you know, you've got elements of truth and elements that are a little bit like, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense. But I can tell you, I remember one of the key parts of Caesar rising to power was, again, military prowess. And so I was going to ask about this with you. What made these sort of like dictators level, like Caesar, to that power? And what sort of influence did that military prowess have from the Roman Empire? But do you have any favorite moments?
I think Caesar's a good example because there's some brilliant battles that he took part in.
Yes.
There's one where he basically trapped a bunch of Gauls inside their fort and built a fort around them to hold off reinforcements. A totally ridiculous idea that actually worked. And that is one of his most well-known endeavors. And what a fantastic legacy to have on your portfolio there. Yeah. Brilliant. But yeah, some of these old dictators and some of the old consuls during the early Republic, we're going to be jumping ahead a little bit, but during the Punic Wars, particularly the second one, Hannibal of Carthage.
Yes, Hannibal, yes, famous.
This is one of my favorite stories. It's not a story because this is history at the end of the day. At this point in time, it's definitely more history as opposed to fable.
Yeah.
But Hannibal takes a bunch of his guys across the Alps with elephants. They walk from Spain to Italy, and the Romans weren't expecting it. And he wreaked absolute havoc. And you got a man who was elected to deal with this threat from the west but the north. And instead he kind of played it on the back foot, and instead of actually engaging in combat as opposed to what Romans always wanted to do, which is just get straight stuck in, beat the crap out of each other, slug it out, and the last one standing wins. This guy, a guy called Fabius, decided to play a war of attrition against Hannibal. And it was relatively successful. He was really disliked for it, but if you're familiar with military tactics, you would recognize that Fabius is somewhat similar to Fabian, and Fabian tactics is something that is quite well known today as well.
Yeah, I mean, how would... Hang on, I'm trying to think of this. You said elephants. I'm sorry, I've latched onto that. I'm kind of taken aback. You're talking about mountains and a terrain that is known today. That is just a slightly impossible story in somewhere or another to have that.
Which is why it's so good.
Yes, like, so true. So how? I'm not gonna actually. I'm not gonna ask the how, because to me, there's no way you could come up with an answer that's gonna convince me that elephants were put over the mountainous areas of Spain and Italy. But I can believe in a force strong enough to be able to, as you said, fight against the Romans and surprise them. Because the Romans, they had, at that point in their empire, there was a level of arrogance.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There was a level of every other country was Rome's to conquer, and the civilizations within them were lesser than Rome, and therefore you had this level of like, we have the best battle practice.
Yeah, Rome has always taken pride on their fighting capability. That's engraved in them from birth. Romulus, in his time of being the king, there was the fights that he had with the Etruscans in the north and all these other tribes in the Italian peninsula. Fighting is what Romans do, and it's what they do best.
Yes. And we've talked about legacy before. The Etruscans still have their sort of grip within Roman lifestyle and Roman sort of history till this day, as well as we've obviously established Romulus himself. Do you think, what is something, apart from talking about Fabian, is there a part of the battles that you've read about or anything that comes to mind where you're like, that, that use of battle strategy or like sort of like fighting style is why the Romans were so powerful?
I think at that particular point in time, Rome was on the back end because Hannibal was a brilliant commander, and he played it to a T. He ended up luring the Romans into a trap because Romans were quite bloodthirsty for him to try and take him out. So every time Hannibal baited, the Romans bit, and they got closer. And I think 3 or 4 or 5 battles, they got absolutely annihilated. But in some of the other conflicts, Hannibal was on the Italian peninsula. Yeah, he was kicking ass, started to dwindle towards the end of his campaign. But elsewhere in the world, Rome was kicking butt. Yeah. In Carthage proper, which modern-day Tunisia, yeah, they were doing a number on Carthage. I think Rome's military, compared to others, was a lot more professional.
Yeah.
During the early days in the Republic, the main soldiers in those armies would do it out of their own pocket. They would buy their own equipment and they would join up, and depending on how much money they have would depend on what type of rank they got. So obviously the richer people could afford the horses, so they're going to be the guys in the cavalry units and be the commanders. Whereas the younger, more ambitious men that have slightly less money could probably only afford a sword and a breastplate and nothing much else.
Yes.
And they would be, quote unquote, cannon fodder for the fights.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you know, Roman military structures had changed a few times. So during its very first institution, it was based on the phalanx.
Yes.
The phalanx, based on Alexander the Great's long hoplites and spears. And then it changed to the more, what's referred to as the maniple system, which is a lot more maneuverable in the hilly regions of Italy's peninsula. Yeah. And then along came the cohorts, these professional government-funded armies that just kicked absolute butt.
And they had these, what we know today as centurions. And they had the whole huge shields where organization of a combination of the phalanx still, because they would use the spears and the swords as sort of like short swords for close quarter combat, and then the long spears and arrows with a combination of shield walls as a way to combat barbarians coming at them from.
Yeah, they had they used to use javelins, which I believe they called the pilum, and it's long. I don't know why I'm going to try and fit this in on the camera because it probably doesn't help, but we'll say that's the whole thing. Okay. And half of it was a wooden shaft, and the other half of it was the metal spike. So they would launch this javelin towards their enemies, and upon impact, it would bend. So where that joint is between the metal and the wood, it would bend. So the enemies, instead of being able to pick up the javelin and throw it back, they couldn't do that. So it was a one-time weapon.
Wow.
If it punctured into one of their shields, they wouldn't be able to remove it because it was just too awkward. It was too long.
And by the time that you're even in the heat of battle, that sort of thought process isn't even gonna comprehend at that period of time.
You have a legionnaire breathing down your throat with a gladius against your neck. It's gonna be a bad time in the middle of a battle.
And we're talking about all sorts of landscapes as well. So with like javelins being thrown, you've got horses, you've got all of these sorts of attack procedures. Barbarians didn't really have much of a chance. And even when the Romans came to the United Kingdom, there's, a lack of organization. And I think that's the main thing the Romans had, was their ability to organize and, fight united in comparison to them.
Yeah, that's spot on, because Rome is very... there's a lot of formation, a lot of organization, whereas you're saying, barbarians, They put on some war paint, they shout really loud and frighten the crap out of everybody else, but they don't fight in unison. And that's what the Roman cohorts and legions and the maniples, anybody who served in that army was, because they were one cohesive unit, and they would all travel together, they would cook food together, they would dig trenches together, they would be a mobile workforce. They would go around with shovels and on their backs and hunting gear. It was really functional.
Yeah. And no one had come up, Alexander the Great did come up with a system. I mean, you could even say that his father came up with that system rather than him, but we're not getting to that.
Of course, yeah.
But the idea of fighting together, living together, it provided that camaraderie. And it was very much so that we always think of Rome as a united front. But from what I'm aware, Rome actually picked at the best parts of other empires. And so when they went to conquer, they would say, these are the best cavalry. We'll have these guys. Let's put them into our cavalry. And they would absorb into different sort of tribes. Do you remember, I think it was like... there was a movie called King Arthur or something along those lines, and
yes,
and
with
this is a
Clive
very
Owen in
old
it.
movie.
Yeah, no, I know that one because guilty pleasure. I actually like that movie.
Yeah, it's good. Original 2003 or something crazy like that. But the main characters were horsemen from the east of Europe.
Yeah,
and they'd been absorbed into the Roman Empire. And their loyalty was purely based off, like, we'll kill your entire tribe if you don't fight for our empire.
Yeah.
Do you think of any other like parts of the the Roman, how it continued to function with stuff like that happening?
I think that might have been one. I speculate that's probably one of the downfalls of the empire at the end of it, because in the early days it was the people who would fight for their land.
Mm.
It was the soldiers who were fighting to protect their mothers and daughters and fathers and brothers and sisters and their family and their friends. Whereas in the later years, because you're putting all these other auxiliary forces, like Gallic spears and Scythian cavalry archers, dragging all these other forces to make your professional army, they're not that invested in defending the heart of Rome anymore. And when you think of one of the great defeats of Rome, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, because that goes down in history as being an absolute disgrace for Rome. Because one of their commanders was an adopted German prince, essentially, who snuck off during a campaigning season, met up with all of his old German tribes and organized essentially a slaughter of the Roman legions, baited them into a trap, and absolute disaster.
And from there, what do you know what year that was at all?
No, but I can find out.
No, I mean, chuck it in there, man. I mean, from what I'm aware, it was the Germans who led to the demise of Rome through the invasion of Rome after that. Is this the sort of like beginning of that?
I think. Okay, so the battle took place in the 9th century, so early on, during the early days of the Empire, I believe. Or Republic. It's one of the two. Either way, it's a win-win.
This is the beginnings of Rome podcast. We don't have to clarify anything to you guys. That's
exactly not. Nah, but it was an absolute disaster, I think.
Do you think
really
the Romans learned from these sort of things, or do you think it was just that arrogance that did lead to the downfall?
I think earlier on, when the nation was small, everything's a lot more immediate, and they are more invested in the immediate surroundings. Like, they're more willing to put up a good fight for the place down the street. Whereas people, when you think about it in the sense of the Britain conquest, they're not going to be that interested in going all the way up to Scotland. And the people in Rome don't give a crap. They're too busy enjoying their grapes and wine
Yes.
and gladiator fights. Like, yes, they get called, oh, we need to send more troops up there. No, they're fine.
It's exactly that, bud. It was this laziness almost that seems to have caused that sort of lack of clarity in the realities of Europe and the surrounding areas of Rome, and the lack of control throughout the empire.
It's also why I think a lot of the later generals of these armies, their troops have ended up backing them, because they wouldn't hear much from back home, and the soldiers be like, well, that guy doesn't give a crap about us, but our general does, so I'm going to support our general. Our general should be Caesar. Our general should lead our nation.
Yes.
And the amount of civil wars that kicked off is phenomenal. All for this basis. It ended up being a case of the army would back the general, and the general would 9 out of 10 times want to do that himself, but sometimes he'll be forced into it by his army in order to pay for their wages or pay for their food.
Yes. And at the end of the day, food and beer and wine were more important than some of the politics that was thrown from the Senate, basically, or the empire.
Yeah.
I love that. That's so interesting.
What more could you possibly want?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're in the grittiness of, some dark, ghoul-infested area in Europe, and you're being told to fight for the good of the empire, we've gone from the beginning where we're fighting for a small village. Rome went from a small village for fighting for guys who were like refugees and found a home, to fighting for this sort of euphoric place that represents everything good in the world.
Yeah.
And you don't know it. You've never been there. So do you think that the generals were a reality check, basically? They were the, like, we want to actually, have some, a piece of this Rome, and the best way we know how to do it is basically by talking to someone who actually knows us.
I think that might have been the case. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, the soldier's wage isn't that great back then. So they want to do what's best for themselves and make sure that their lives are going to be comfortable. One of the big appeals of joining the military in that cohort after the Marian reforms is when you retired, you get your own little bit of farmland.
Yes.
And that goes back to the tale of Cincinnatus, of the ideal Republican citizen who would go and do his duty for the Republic and then return to their farmland. It's ideal. It's what everybody would have wanted. And I think even today, everybody would appreciate having a bit of land of their own.
Yes. If there was enough.
If there was enough. But when these promises aren't fulfilled and cuts are being made, it's going to piss off quite a few people.
Yes.
And when the general says, no, we're going to do this, and I'm going to make sure that after we succeed in doing this, we're going to return to Rome as heroes, we're going to have a triumph, a big celebration, there's going to be feasting, and we're all going to get what is rightfully ours.
It's fascinating to know that you can simply put it down to that. Like, it can just be that consequence of just like, you're going to have a full belly and a mug of mead, and we're not going to have to think about going to the United Kingdom anytime soon, basically.
Yeah. It's basic human rights.
Yeah.
Maybe not the mead.
It's a beautiful dream. It's a beautiful dream, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
But
being able to have a shelter and some food and some water.
Yeah.
Like 3 basic things, and most of the time, legions wouldn't necessarily get all of that.
It's true.
This is old times. Rome's brilliant. They had their own central heat and everything, but for the legionnaires at the front lines, they have to pitch their tents.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I was going to ask you, is there a piece of technology you can think of that the Romans had that, would help this? How did they deal with water, for instance? We know in Rome they had the huge sort of like, I forgot what the aqueducts.
And reservoirs.
Is there anything that comes to mind that you're like, oh, that's here today, and I love that, seeing that in those days?
Central heating as a concept is fantastic.
Yes.
But even brick and mortar, Because I think I might be correct in saying this. If not, we can always ask our good friend Mr. Edwards, the architectural student. But Roman mortar was pretty good, and I don't think they can replicate it to this day.
Well, they had in London and in England, they had these architectural structures that were there hundreds of years later, and they couldn't reproduce the structure of the Roman sort of like buildings that they'd created to this point. And it was architecturally, I think at the time they were just dumbfounded. Why are we not using mud bricks and straw and stuff like that? It's like crazy to look at some pale white sort of marble from time to time, which is what the Romans were famous for.
Some of the other things they brought about, like the roads, like all roads lead to Rome, and the world is covered in them now. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? We think about like roundabouts being a thing like that we created in the United Kingdom, and it's not at all. It's the Romans came up with that for carts, basically, and like the exits were there for like the idea of horse and carts going around a marketplace, basically. So it's just fascinating to think about those sort of things. Dan, I don't know where, a better way to end this apart from ask you this final question based off Rome.
Yeah, go for it.
What would be your favorite part of the beginnings of Rome? What's the like thing that comes up? Technology, anything that you're thinking of, like republic, person?
I mean, they're all such good characters. Early days, during the Republic, it's got to be the Second Punic War. Hearing about Hannibal and his vendetta, his blood feud with Rome, amazing stuff. Old Roman Kingdom, Romulus and Remus, their origin stories, Romulus's magical disappearance on top of the hill one day, his declaration of "I've got no more vultures, I'm the king." I think it's just brilliant. It's as close to a real life fantasy story as I can get to.
Oh, beautiful song and dance right there, bud, of the ideas of eagles and birds and Romulus and Remus. It's a brilliant way to summarize it. It really is, bud. And to me, I totally agree in the ideas that it's a lovely story being built to build this foundation and to justify the dominance of Rome later on in life and how it began. So absolutely beautiful. Dan, we've got to do this again. We've got to do a part 2 at least at some point in time. I really
absolutely hope... I could talk about this subject for days.
Brilliant, mate. Brilliant. Oh, well, we'll have you back on at some point. And once again, thank you, Dan Clifton, for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Guys, this has been the Taylor's Tales podcast. This has been Chris's Corner. I'm your host, Chris Taylor. Once again, thanks, Dan Clifton. See you guys next week.
Take care, guys.